Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today uh, and recognize our 2023 Linda Duttenhaver Distinguished Alumni Award recipient, Dr. Kendall King. Dr. King is a two-time UCEAP participant from UC Santa Barbara. She first was at the Complutense in University of Madrid in Spain in 1989 and 90, and then again in 1991 at UNAM in Mexico City. There, she participated in a combined research and service learning program. I hope we can hear a little bit more about that today. Upon graduation, she completed both her MA and PhD in educational linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, Dr. King is a professor of multilingual education at the University of Minnesota, where she teaches and conducts research in the area of applied linguistics and language teaching and learning. So please welcome and congratulate Dr. Kendall King on being our 9th annual Distinguished Alumni Award winner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the honor to be here. I thought I would share the wonderful box that came with the actual awards. So here's a beautiful award, a t-shirt that I actually wore today when I went running. Super cute, and a mug. So thank you for the award and for this recognition. I'm really honored. I'd also really like to thank Carol Podney, a fellow UCEA peer who nominated me. And I'm really thankful for the opportunity to reflect a little bit on my UCEAP experience and to share a bit about what it's meant for me as a professional and just as importantly, I think, as a person. So as noted in the introduction, I was a two-time UCEA peer. Here's some photos here from the 80s. You can tell by the hair. I think that it was some time ago. I did one academic year in Madrid, 89 to 90, and a quarter in Mexico. So for me at that time, as for many UC study abroad students, it was a lot of firsts. So 1989, at the age of 19, it was my first time in Europe. It was certainly my first time being away from home that long. It was my first time taking content classes in a second language, meeting with a professor and talking about those classes in a second language, reading intensively for meaning in a second language. It was my first time traveling independently. We were very interested in going to Morocco. That was a top destination, which we were pretty unprepared for, I think. Our first cross-cultural romances and our first time looking for an apartment. I'm sure things have changed. You know, in my field, applied linguistics, we are always looking for authentic language learning experiences. And this was one of those. At that time, our director of studies gave us the newspaper and said, go find an apartment. So that was a huge adventure to read the ads, try to understand the ads, try to figure out where the place was, to negotiate the rent. So that was a huge language learning and life learning experience. And you, I'm sure, remember that in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. So that meant many students and young people from Eastern Europe were traveling to the West, including to Spain. So it was our first time having the chance to spend time with youth from Eastern Europe. So I was able to spend 12 months away at University at the Complutense in Madrid, and to finish enough requirements in 2 quarters of my senior year that I was allowed to do able to do another short-term study abroad trip to Mexico City. And I believe with some institutional support that it made it less expensive to do this than to stay in Isla Vista for a quarter, for my final quarter. So I was thrilled to get to go abroad as a more seasoned traveler, as a probably advanced low, intermediate high speaker of Spanish at that point. And this was my first time to get to live with Mexican students from all over the country, to get to understand something about their regional differences. First time, for instance, experiencing different dialects of Spanish, Mexican Spanish in particular, and gaining some understanding, beginning understanding of like the politics of race and class and power that came with those language differences. I also want to note that many of the California students on my program were Mexican Americans, raised in the US, and they had varied and sometimes really difficult experiences in Mexico City. So I learned a tremendous amount from them about their from those friends about their sometimes warm and sometimes not so warm reception in Mexico City. So the photos you see, obviously the first one is UNAM. The others are from the state of Tabasco and the town of Tamote de las Sábanas, which was an indigenous Mayan Chontal community that was in the process of shifting from speaking Maya Chontal to speaking Spanish. So my project there for about 6 to 8 weeks was to work in an art school. I did that. I'm not much of an artist, but I became very interested in the process of language learning and language change, and language loss in particular that was happening there. So that really all shaped profoundly my career trajectory. My experiences in Spain led me to be interested in language learning and psychology. And initially, I thought I would do sort of more cognitive experimental work. But after my time in Mexico, kind of seeing processes of language contact, language loss, I became much more interested in how language learning was linked to culture, power, race, and interested in doing a study that had more of an anthropological turn. So I shifted a little bit. I ended up doing a PhD in educational linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania, where I researched Quechua language loss and revitalization in the Andes. So the photo that you see there is my dissertation, which was later published as a book. And the photo is of the indigenous Seruguru people who I worked with in that community. So that project was really about understanding the processes and prospects of language revitalization. As you're probably aware, most of the world's languages are in the process of being lost. That is, they're no longer intergenerationally transmitted. So when the speakers of that language die, the language itself will die or no longer be spoken. So my book was really about like, why are so many languages being lost and how can we support them through policy, through educational programs? And one of the things that I found was that, this is sort of the short answer to that question, that with the process of bringing a language back actually entails bringing it forward, introducing new forms, right? We need new words, for instance, to talk about math or science, new functions. We end up using language in totally different ways, to do Zoom on the internet, to text. And also new has a potential to introduce new social lines in division, right? So what does it mean, for instance, to be a good speaker, in this case of Quechua, or an educated speaker of Quechua? These were questions that didn't exist 30 years ago. So I went on after graduating to continue to work in the area of bilingualism, language contact, applied linguistics. I'd be happy to talk about any of those topics. I worked at NYU as an assistant professor, at Georgetown as an associate professor, and I'm now at the University of Minnesota, where I'm a professor of multilingual education, and I do research on all of these topics. I'd have to say that top amongst my favorite administrative jobs is I direct an undergraduate minor in TESOL. This is teaching English to speakers of other languages. This is a program which helps undergrads prepare to teach English abroad and also prepare to be better language learners if and when they choose to go abroad. Another big effort has been a funded project to support multilingualism across the state, developing materials in Spanish and 8 other languages that are common in Minnesota to support multilingualism. So I guess I'd say with total certainty, my career as a language scholar would not have been possible without study abroad. Both the language skills I need to do this work, but also, and maybe more importantly, the empathy and understanding and interest rather in understanding different social systems. The second point I really want to highlight is the lifelong friendships. And I think these were equally, if not more important. You see some photos here from 1990. And these friends, 4 of us in particular, for the last 35 years, we have reunited and caught up with each other, even though we've lived all over the world. I think I have a photo here from Madrid. This is a UCEAP reunion in 2018. So we are now in our mid-50s. I guess you can do the math as well as I can. So that is 3+ years of friendship. And I would note similar impact of UCEAP on all of us. Carol Podney and Amy Zukowicz, with the darker hair, are teachers in California who use Spanish every day. And Heather Bortfeld is a professor specializing in psycholinguistics and auditory processing with an emphasis on bilingual development at UC Merced. So these relationships, which no doubt were forged in that 1 year together we had in 89 and 90, and cemented through that time together, are really an unexpected gift of study abroad. So lastly, I wrote this talk and kind of gathered the photos on an international flight home last month. And I was kind of flipping through those and thinking about the sort of snowball effect that study abroad has had towards creating greater connection, openness, empathy, and communication. So I want to close with 3 highlights. One was having a French exchange student in our family for the summer. You'll see on the left. Another was my husband and I went back to Ecuador, and you see in this photo we had the chance to help this couple, this family who had locked their key in their car and broken their window, but they still couldn't reach it. So we have as you can see here, my husband looks like a giant, very long arms that allowed us to get the key out. So it was just, we were all delirious that we solved that problem. And the third was a goodbye lunch I had with a colleague I hosted for the whole year from Ethiopia and Israel. So these are like totally tiny, random, everyday events in lots of ways. But they were also made possible, I think, and set in motion through study abroad. So I think for me and for all the students who are lucky enough to have this experience and time, really extended time, immersed time in another culture, cultivates not just language skills, but also an understanding of experience for others, and allows some space for self-reflection on one's own strengths, values, limitations, and particular privileges, and deepens our empathy with others from different backgrounds and life ways. So I think as we live, unfortunately, in an increasingly polarized, unequal, and chaotic times, these values and insights are needed more than ever. So thank you. I am thankful and proud to be an alumnus of the UCEAP program, and I have a few minutes to answer questions, if you have any, or to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Do we have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat yet, but you can also raise your hand if you're comfortable, and we can call on you. You can ask Kendall directly if you have a question. Go ahead, Bryn.
I just wanted to understand the distinction between the different levels of endangered languages that you have on that chart there. There's severely, critically. Yeah, I would love to understand the distinction between them.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference in terms of stability is the language being transmitted intergenerationally, right? That makes sense. So those are most of the green ones. So is there a collective group of speakers, and are there young people who are still speaking the language? Now, it's possible that it could be a very small number, and that language, if those speakers unfortunately were killed all at once, that would be extinct. But most of the greens have that intergenerational transmission and a significant number of speakers. Critically endangered is maybe you just have a few elderly speakers who are geographically dispersed, and there's not very much support for that language. And then the orange and the yellow are sort of somewhere in between. So maybe you have a group of speakers who are 40 and 50, and the kids can understand it, but they can't speak the language, right? If the 20-year-olds can understand the language, but they can't speak it, it doesn't look so good, right? Thanks.
Christine, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Oh, yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for the presentation. Congratulations, Kendall. I was the EAP director in Spain 10 years after you were there, so I missed you by 10 years, which doesn't mean that I'm younger than you are.
Oh.
But I had a question concerning your subject matter. There is a recent tendency, particularly in the Andes, your place of research, where filmmaking has become a very important asset in order to rescue the language. I'm talking Quechua, Aymara, and also Shipibo, no, which is an Amazonian language. And there was a recent interview by a very versed journalist, Patricia Marin. Her program is Valicha. And he talked about the enormous growth of filmmaking in those three languages, no, which is part of a positive aspect of rescuing languages. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, because filmmaking might be as important as intergenerational transmission of languages. No?
Yes, it's really exciting to see all these developments, the film, of course, and other media. And now, of course, we have the technology to share that media. You don't have to go to a movie to see a movie in Quechua. You can see it on your phone or your device. So all of that technological and artistic innovation is certainly a positive for the language. However, I have to be a little pessimistic and take the position of a very famous scholar in this area named Joshua Fishman, who passed away recently, and say, to quote him, if that effort towards film or technology is not supporting intergenerational transmission of the language, then it's just, to use his words, biding time, right? That's great to raise the status, great to raise the awareness of the language. All of that is a plus. The problem with that, or the limitation, is it doesn't do anything directly to grow the number of speakers and to reinstate that intergenerational transmission. We know as language speakers, and our language experts and speakers, that we don't learn that much from our phones, right? Or from passive media like television or film. We can learn a little, we can learn some vocabulary, maybe we can pick up the accent, but we are hardwired and designed to learn language with people we care about doing stuff that's important to us. So unless film kind of supports that sort of human to human interaction, I'm not particularly optimistic that it could save the day. In the same way, I'm not that optimistic that an education program, and that's one of the things I found in my dissertation, that teaching the language for a half an hour a day in the schools is not enough either. You know, it's better than nothing. You can, to kind of use a dark metaphor, it's a little like can keep the language on life support, but it's not enough to bring it back alone. So I think it's great, but I have a little asterisk of concern about putting all of our eggs in that basket.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Janet, who says, you mentioned 8 languages. So besides Spanish, what are the other 7 languages in the TESOL program?
Oh, I'm so happy you mentioned that. So our TESOL program is actually about teaching English to speakers of other languages. So that's a program that kind of prepares in quotation marks, kind of provides like beginning preparation for them to be English teachers abroad. The program that I was mentioning, the 8 languages is about supporting multilingualism in our state, and in particular our SEAL. California, of course, has been a leader with the multilingual and bilingual SEALs, where we also have a SEAL. Our less commonly taught languages in Minnesota are quite different. Our language profile looks a little bit different. So we've been trying to provide support not only to Spanish, but to Amharic, Hmong, Karen, Somali, and Vietnamese. Might be missing one. But Minnesota is long time, for many decades, has been a place that has many people in our school system from refugee backgrounds, and those are languages that are well represented. So if you go to that site, Minnesota Bilingual Seals, you can see a little bit of what a test looks like in each of those languages. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. Okay, Hannah Irvine asks, do you have a few examples from the endangered categories of endangered languages?
Endangered. Oh, well, I would sadly say that Quechua is endangered. There are, that's the language I know best. There are elderly speakers of that language, and there are certainly new speakers of that language as well who've learned it formally. One of the things I found was that I kind of suggested in this slide that there's lines of division. There's sort of the traditional Quechua that older people speak, and then that's called Quechua auténtico, and then Quechua unificado, which is what one learns in school and speaks sort of formally. And has kind of an academic sound to it. So there are young speakers. I don't see a huge number of signs, except in some specific pockets, that there is widespread intergenerational transmission. You know, I'm always a little reluctant to say, oh, that it's endangered. So I'm thinking even about my own context in Minnesota, where we have Ojibwe and Dakota, are indigenous languages that are endangered. Most speakers are elderly. There are not huge numbers of young speakers, but as was suggested by a previous participant, there are lots of signs of innovation and interest in the language as well. So I think we have to be careful about predicting the demise of languages. We want to support all of these efforts in any way that we can, but there are at the same time, we need to be realistic, and that there are signs of concern that there are not huge numbers of people who are using the language naturally in the home again. For both of those, all the languages I just mentioned, I would say they're fragile.
Thank you so much. We still have a couple minutes, and if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. But I thought in the meantime, I would ask for those students who are going abroad on language-based programs, what recommendations do you have to actually attain language skills on those programs? We have students going on shorter programs, a semester, a summer, or a year. What would you recommend as the best technique to pick up language?
Oh, I'm guessing it's going to be the same that everybody says, like, put your phone down, try to disconnect from your US communities. I am actually thankful that we did not have that technology when we were abroad. We were able to we didn't really have a choice. We were there. Beyond that, I think it's easy to say, stay away from all Americans, stay away from all your friends. I think that's a little bit too unrealistic. You need your support system, as my slide suggested, but to immerse yourself in activities that are going to require you to talk. And better, if you can find something to volunteer, an activity, a sports, something that you can do where you will be with the people in the community that you're visiting. I would support that. To not be, it's scary, right? To try to do stuff in a second language, but to put yourself out there as much as you can. We know from studies of second language acquisition that one of the main drivers of language learning is something called the negotiation of meaning, which sounds really fancy, but that is just trying to get something done, like buy milk or figure out how to play a game together or get an apartment, right? That requires you to talk, to listen, to get feedback on what you thought you were saying and what you actually said, to make modifications, and then to be understood. So those are all of the kind of micro pieces of learning, and we get those just when we get ourselves out there in the world trying to do stuff in that additional language.
I think that hasn't changed either. Maybe somebody from our Spain programs team can confirm, but I believe students still have to arrive and then sort of find their housing, and it causes a lot of it is definitely a challenge for many of them. We read about it in their scholarship applications or other testimonials we receive, that it is it's definitely sometimes one of the first things they've done, and it's really challenging still.
Oh, that's so interesting. I had sort of assumed like, oh, that's how it was in the old days, and now it's all planned and organized. I'm kind of glad to hear that, because it's a memorable experience.
Yeah, Monica, I saw that you gave a thumbs up. Monica works on our program side of things, so I assume that's a confirmation. And I had friends abroad in 2015 who had to go find their own apartment a couple times. So it's but I love the newspaper, and Janet points out the same. The professor who gave you the newspaper to go find an apartment was a great challenge, but very practical. So yeah. We have a question from Peter, which is, in your opinion, which states are best at teaching languages to English native speakers, and what can other states learn from these states?
Oh my gosh. I'd have to say California is a leader. I mean, it's had its ups and downs with different initiatives, of course, but California has led the way in thinking about and developing bilingual programming, supporting Indigenous languages in many cases, and kind of recognizing California was the leader in the SEAL program. If you don't know, this is a credential that students in high school can get, one that certifies they are proficient not only in English, but in an additional language. They get a sticker on their high school diploma as a recognition of those skills, and that can be used sometimes for college admissions, but also in some states like mine for credits when they enroll in higher education. So I say as a country, we have a long way to go, but I would point to California over my own state in its recognition of multilingualism.
Well, I think, yeah, I don't think we have any more questions, so we can just wrap it up. Thank you so much, Kendall. I love seeing this picture of Berlin. I was there as well that year. It was pretty monumental. I still have my little bag of the wall that I chipped away. So I love seeing that. I love seeing the photos of you from, of course, I'm also a child of the 80s and 90s with big hair. And anyways, it brings back a lot of memories, a lot of fond memories for me, and I'm sure other people on the call. So we're so happy to recognize you with this award, and thank you so much for being a fabulous advocate for study abroad and for continuing the work that you do with language and international education. So one more time, thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kendall.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.